Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Humm. I'm one of the Dialogue Doctor editors, and I'm here with Gemma Clatworthy today to talk about one of her books in progress. Gemma, you want to introduce yourself and your stories?
So hi there, I'm Gemma Clatworthy. I also write urban fantasy under G Clatworthy. And I started writing back in 2020 during one of the lockdowns, really as a bit of catharsis because I was super close to burnout. And my very first book was actually a children's book, which was called The Girl Who Lost Her Listening Ears. So I think that gives you some idea of how our lockdown experience went here. But I quickly moved on to urban fantasy because I love the genre. I love mixing magic and the mundane world. And I'm really fortunate. I live over here in the UK in the magical county of Wiltshire with my family and two cats. And outside of writing, I love drinking tea, eating chocolate, and playing board games of all kinds. So that's a little bit about me. And then in terms of the stories, so we're going to talk today about one of the books in my Omensford series, which is a spin-off from my very first urban fantasy series, which followed a half-dwarf protagonist as she battles dragons and falls in love with an arrogant elf. So this series is a bit more of a witchy, I'm going to call it a cozy urban fantasy with a dash of murder mystery set in the Cotswolds. So if Jessica Fletcher worked in IT and lived in an English village and had magic, that is the vibe for this series that we're going to be discussing today.
Excellent. Well, you have been very busy since the first lockdown. You wrote a children's book, a first series, and now this is book 4 in your second series, correct? That we're working on today?
That's correct. So book 4 is called Pumpkins and Pop Stars. And you can see book 1 in the image behind me, which is out and available on Amazon.
Excellent. So book 1 is called Bed, Socks, and Broomsticks.
Yes.
And book 2 is?
Book 2 is Cream Teas and Crystal Balls, and book 3 is Donkeys and Demons, and that is out. So we're recording on the 16th of April, and it's out on, I think, the 25th of April, so about next week from when we're recording.
Well, that's so exciting. I can't wait to get in and get some of those. And I have a holiday coming up, so maybe I have a new series to read. Thank you. That's really exciting. So you picked Pumpkins and Pop Stars to review today. And can you tell us a little bit about what your goal is in reviewing the chapters that you sent?
Yeah, so we're actually going to talk through the climax of Pumpkins and Pop Stars. There will be spoilers. I'll just say it like now. It's the climax. You're going to find out who did it and all that stuff. But really, what I wanted to get at was kind of the tension. So this is the climax. So over the series of, I think it's 3 or 4 chapters, we find out who the killer is. There's the confrontation with the killer, who you will find out shortly, but I'll keep the suspense a tiny little bit longer. And then I can't remember if we get to the point where there's the apprehension. I think we do. And then at the very end, kind of some additional characters turn up. So there are, I think, 4 main characters for the majority of this who have dialogue. So there's the main character who is called Fee. She's the IT witch who can control electricity, but she's not very comfortable with her powers or at ease with them. That's her growth journey through the series. There's her sister, older sister, Agatha, who has earth-based, plant-based magic. She's more of a nature witch, and she's definitely got protective older sister vibes going on. There's Fiona's familiar, who is a small dragon-like creature who thinks she knows best, and she's been around a long time. She was another witch's familiar before she got joined with Fee. So she's quite sarcastic, and yeah, she knows what she's doing. And then you've got the killer. I would say those are the kind of main characters over the course of this.
Excellent. Now, for Fee's familiar, can only Fee talk to her familiar, or can Agatha also talk to her?
No, so only Fee can talk
Only
to
Fee.
the familiar. Well,
Okay.
so so anyone can talk to the familiar. The familiar can hear and understand what anyone is saying, but she can only communicate psychically to Fee. So in
Okay.
the text, I think you're going to share your screen at some point.
Mhm.
Italics is kind of denotes that Cressida, that's the familiar, is talking, and she speaks directly into Fee's mind. So
Excellent.
Agatha and killers cannot hear that.
Excellent. That was really helpful to me. I could see, like, I'm sharing my screen now. So here is the familiar here speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sure because again, we're picking up in the late part of the book. I'm sure that that's explained earlier on. You wouldn't want to explain it this late in the story. So thanks. That really helps me. Um, can the others see Fee's familiar?
Yeah. So
Okay.
she's so this is an open world magic system. So people know or are aware that witches and magic and other types of magical beings exist, and a small dragon called worms. I would say it's unusual, but they're visible. It's just like having a small cat or dog,
Okay.
but a dragon.
Fantastic. I love it. I want a small dragon now. And
I
tell me
mean, so do
house.
I.
Me
That's why I wrote one in the book, right?
That's right. I can see Jason now getting his little shoulder bag with this little dragon in it that he carries around everywhere. I think he'd be down with that. So, all right. Tell us a little bit about, so we're going to work today on making sure that the intensity of those climactic scenes are really impactful. So we'll talk today about that. Will you walk us through the chapters that you gave me, and then we'll pick one to work on together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I gave you a tiny bit of context because I try and break chapters so that the reader wants more and wants to know what's going to happen next. So the very end of chapter 34 you've got up there, and that's basically where they find the layer of the pumpkin. They're starting this crazy plan to confront a killer. And then 35 is where they how to describe it. They kind of work their way through the clearing, and then they actually find out that the killer is a spoiler giant sentient pumpkin that from book one was Agatha's prize-winning pumpkin from Halloween Fate that, through a magical accident, gained sentience and kind of escaped, and it's been roaming the Cotswolds countryside. And recently, in the Halloween after that happened, it has been killing people. So they find it, and at the end of that chapter, Fee tries to arrest it, which it obviously doesn't like. So then into chapter 36, they realize that this sentient pumpkin can talk, and that it sort of explains why it was killing people, which is in essence because at Halloween, what do you see around a lot? Hollowed out jack-o'-lanterns. So in the pumpkin's eyes, it is feeling that its brothers and sisters have been murdered, and it's taking some revenge. So that's chapter 36. And then in chapter 37, when the pumpkin realizes that nobody is on its side, there's kind of in chapter 37, then that is where it sort of lashes out and it tries to escape slash kill Fee and Agatha. So they have that kind of big fight. And these are all quite short chapters to help with the speed of it, and also because it's quite a short, sort of quick book. So then in chapter 38, that's the continuation of the conflict and kind of the, you know, how is Fiona going to deal with it, because she has killed people with her magic before. She doesn't really want to do it again, but she might have to protect her sister. So that's kind of the internal conflict there, through to chapter 39, where she makes her final like choice and realizes what she has to do to beat the pumpkin. And I think that was the end of the extract that I gave you.
Yep. Excellent. So you mentioned that you kept these chapters short to keep the story moving. I think this is one of those things where, as writers, we want the story to move quickly. So we rely on telling or making changes happen very quickly because we know where the story is going. The reader, however, has put in all this effort and all this energy to read all of the buildup, all of the character development, all of the clues, all of the story. And now they get to the end and it all wraps up in 5 minutes. Hallmark movies, I don't know how many Hallmark movies you watch, but Hallmark and actually the Lifeline movies are the same way, right? Like you have 2 hours and 50 minutes of buildup, and then everything resolves in 4.5 minutes so that the credits can run and we can still move into the next 2-hour segment. And while, don't get me wrong, I do love me a Hallmark movie, I always feel at the end like I've invested all this time, all this emotional energy into these characters. Let me enjoy the win that they have of being together or solving the mystery, or in the Lifetime case, like resolving lifetime of trauma in 4 minutes, right? Like I want to lean into that. I always want to know what happens afterward. So as a writer, we have to kind of balance that need to let the reader get the payoff of their investment, but still make them feel like there is no time passing at all. We want to put them in that weird conundrum where it feels like it's only been 5 minutes, but they put it down and they walk away and they're like, wait a minute, where did the last 20 minutes, where did the last half hour go? So we're going to try to balance that. And the way that I feel is the most impactful is to really do what you were saying that you wanted in this scene, which is really bump the emotional intensity. So to bump the emotional intensity, we don't always have to add a fight or, somebody lurking in the shadows or suspense. Those things obviously are going to build intensity, but what we want to do is we want to lean in to the emotions that people are feeling. We want to lean in to what's happening in the story. And we want the beats to happen very, very fast. So I did a solo episode, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago. I don't know, time's not really my forte. A while back. You can go back and listen to it if you want. But we talk about zooming in and zooming out, the way that you would think about moving on the highway or thinking about retelling what happened on a road trip. When you are talking about being on a road trip, you're not going to talk about every single mile marker you pass. You're going to let those things happen pretty quickly in your story. And you're like, okay, well, I left from, place A and I drove 400 miles and I got to place B. But when I got to place B, let me tell you all the things that I saw, because I was slowing down and I was seeing every building and every person and whatever else that one sees when they get to a new place, right? Like you really want to zoom in on that. And that's what you want to do here. These chapters that you gave me, they're your climax. You want to spend a little bit more time. Now, obviously words matter and word count matters, especially if you're writing a smaller, cozy novel that has fewer pages. You want to be careful that you don't write the same number of pages in your climax than you do earlier, or the same number of words. But spacing can really be a part of this as well. So we'll zoom in and I'll actually show you what that can look like here together. I do want to take a moment to talk about the editing process that I used here in this section. So sometimes when I'm working with an author and I'm editing a piece for them, they're going to send me their piece and I'm actually going to do all of the markup ahead of time. And then when I get on the call with them, I explain to them, okay, I made this change here. I made this suggestion here. I'm not sure what you wanted here. So here are my 2 suggestions. And we actually walk line by line through the suggestions that I made. For you, however, you are talking about wanting to grow your writing in this area. It sounded like maybe this is something that you've thought about in other books, but really wanted to spend time on in this book. And I also noticed that there are a couple of chapters here. So if I had edited through, I would have edited through all of your chapters, made all of the notes, and then walked them through with you. Whereas what I wanted to do instead is take one chapter and really zoom in with you, no pun intended, since we were just talking about zooming in on dialogue, but like really take time to process what I'm seeing and where I think that there are opportunities so that you can kind of learn it as a skill. Because one of the things that we want to do with the dialogue, and also so that the listeners can hear this, because one of the things that we want to do with the dialogue doctor is we want to empower authors to be able to take these skills and apply them on their own. We don't want them to feel like, oh, well, Jeff and Laura do it this way, and they're the only ones who can do this, so let me continuously come back to them. We love having people in the community. We love teaching, but we also want people to feel really empowered to take these skills and know that they can absolutely do them by themselves. So that's why I chose this approach for you today. Whereas maybe if you've watched me edit on other podcasts or listened to me edit on other podcasts, I would have brought something to the table for other people. I wanted to kind of turn it around and start from the blank page, not the blank page, the base page, and build up on it. So that sound okay?
Yeah, that absolutely works.
Okay.
Keen to hear what you think.
Excellent.
I've got notes here as well, like I have it printed out, so just forgive me while I shuffle some papers.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Before we get started, do you have any questions for me?
Well, I'm always keen, like, for what a new reader thinks, which I know is really challenging because I sent you literally just the climax and none of the rest of the story. But if you have any initial kind of gut reactions, I'd be very interested in hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually, please do not feel weird about sending me just the climax. Sometimes I go into a bookstore and I literally just pick a random page and start reading. I just like the way that, like, if you can pick up a story anywhere and be interested in it, likely starting from the beginning is also going to be interesting. So I was very intrigued by your story. So I don't spend a lot of time reading in the magical realm. So when I do read in the magical realm, I'm always excited to see, like, the different ways people interpret how magic could happen. And I was really excited to learn more about Fee, because you describe her as like using her hands as the catalyst for her magic. And then you did the same thing with Aggie later, and her hands started turning green. And I just thought that was like such vivid imagery about, what was happening. And I have never read a story where the killer was this kind of inanimate object before. So I was both surprised and intrigued. And what I love about it, and again, spoiler alert for anyone who's listening, what I loved about it was kind of like a Frankenstein meets The Great Pumpkin, with Charlie Brown, right? It was like this moment where I'm trying to visualize in my head this pumpkin demon and how it's killing people, right? So obviously I didn't get the earlier chapters to hear kind of like how the murders happened. But now that I'm reading in the middle of it, I'm like, I gotta go back. I gotta find out, like, is this pumpkin smashing people? Is he like, how is this right? Like, so I was very intrigued by it. So
Oh, well, I'm glad about that. And I love your mashup of Frankenstein and Charlie Brown because that, that is sort of what I have in my head. And someone has graffitied on this huge pumpkin as well. So it does have like a painted on face, which you get some of the description of in these chapters. But
okay.
that's probably a little bit of backstory for like how it looks and how it has
Excellent.
a face.
That's fantastic. Okay, so now that we kind of have the backstory, any other questions before we dig in?
No, let's dive in.
Okay, so we're going to start in chapter 36. And in chapter 36, this is the first time the pumpkin speaks.
It is.
So we know from the scene that obviously the pumpkin is in the scene. We have Fiona and we have Agatha. Quick question for you. Is Fee's familiar here?
Um, yeah, I think she is around, but
Okay.
I don't think she speaks in this scene, but I think she's probably around.
Okay. So that was a big, and one of the reasons why I asked you so much about the familiar, will you say her name for me one more time, please? The familiar's name?
Cressida.
Cressida. Okay. I'm going to try to remember that. Excellent. So she was in the previous scene. She was talking to Fiona in the previous scene. And she shows up again in the next scene during the fight. So she kind of disappeared here for me.
Yeah.
So we want to that's one thing that we want to make sure from a reader's perspective is that they know where all the characters are at all times. Now, if she's the kind of familiar that can like disappear and reappear or become part of Fiona and then come out, like that's an easy way to describe why a character is no longer there, right? If she kind of flees when she's scared, then, that's another way, like if you've set it up in past books. But as I was reading into this chapter, I was trying to keep the picture in my head. And just before this chapter, Fiona and Agatha were like hiding behind a log. So I assumed Cressida, did I say that right?
Yeah.
Okay, Cressida was with them hiding from this pumpkin monster. And then they're coming out. So like in my mind, they come out from behind the log, but I don't know where Cressida is, which is something that happens all the time with writers because you see the picture in your head. You know that she's either staying behind the log or she's following Fiona and she doesn't say anything until Fiona asks her, until somebody else, right? Or whatever. You know that in your head, but that's what I refer to as an editor as reader burden. Because now, instead of focusing on this giant pumpkin propelling itself across the field, I'm not worried about that pumpkin because I want to know where Cressida is. And it's okay to create a little bit of confusion and a little bit of tension with your readers that way, but you want to make sure as a writer that you're doing that intentionally and you're communicating that to us as the reader at some point in the story. So that was my first note about this chapter, is just make sure all of your characters are accounted for, especially because I would say this chapter is, while it's really important because it's the first time the pumpkin speaks, it's also your bridge chapter from the very high intensity, hey, we found the killer, to the chapter that's like, hey, we're going to fight this killer, right? Like it's that bridge in the middle that you just want to make sure that we're not distracting the reader at all from the intensity of the scene by wondering something like that. So as we look and we look at what you have in the dialogue here, we'll talk about like where we can put some of Cressida's dialogue to help us know where she is throughout this part of the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's fair. I think what I had in mind was that so the pumpkin was created through a freak fusion of Agatha and Fiona's magic, but way back in like book one, and you're kind of not really sure. It turns up in a couple of the other books as like sightings of a pumpkin just roaming the countryside, as you do. And then sort of this is the climax. So it's kind of a story that's been building through a few books. So yeah, I wanted the focus to be on like those two, and they've realized that they've created this freak pumpkin that is also a murderer. And then the pumpkin is also kind of like the first word it speaks is like mother in, you know, a really Frankenstein-y kind of way. Because it, you know, it realizes that it's the offspring of these two magical beings. So it's, yeah, I wanted the focus on like those three characters, but I can definitely see how leaving Cressida out, like I don't want to confuse the readers. They need to be focused on that interaction.
Right.
So
yeah. And I love what you're saying about your intentionality as a writer, because this is an editor's job, is to take the intentionality of the writer and say, okay, this is where you want your focus to be. This is how it translates as a reader. This is the piece that I wanted. And you can handle this in a couple of different ways. You can say, like, in the last chapter, you can have them stepping forward and telling and her telling Cressida, stay where you are, right? Like, don't move until I come back. And then now you've all of a sudden in one sentence taken care of a character who is now no longer part of the scene. And then when you need her again, Fiona can call her and she can come back, right? So you don't actually have to include her in the scene, though maybe you want to, maybe as we're taking this, because the other thing is not being familiar with your story, but familiar with familiars. That's a lot of weirdness there for me. You know, everybody writes familiars a little bit differently. So based off of the laws and the rules that you've created between your familiar and Fiona, especially because this is not your first book, you have 3 books ahead of this one that establishes their relationship. You can create whatever kind of world you want for them. If you mentioned that Cressida is kind of a know-it-all. So maybe there is a place for her in the scene where she is actually explaining some of the backstory to the reader in a way that you don't necessarily need it to be in dialogue. But we'll get to that. Let's look at these first moments that you've given us, because like you said, the pumpkin starts with this Frankenstein-y mother, right? Like this, you know, it's this super intense moment, right? So you start with this great setup line about the pumpkin coming. Fiona draws her magic into her hands and takes up a fighting stance. Then we have this noise. And then Fiona freezes. But then we have all of this additional information about the thing had spoken. She tilted her head, unsure if Agatha was playing some sort of sick joke on her. And then the pumpkin speaks again. If you want to bump the intensity of this, you want to keep the reader moving as quickly as they can with new information as fast as possible. So I recommend that we actually, sorry, I'm going to track changes in here for you. Sorry, Word keeps changing on me and I never know how it works. All right,
yeah,
so if we take this out, so it just goes, mother, Fee froze. Mother, the voice was thick and deep. And we take out the dense mist here. Pumpkin, Agatha crept out from behind the log. maybe Fee says, and again, I'm going to take some editorial liberties here. As the writer, you're going to go back through this and you're going to be like, no, Laura, Fee would never say that. She would say this. But what I want is just to kind of get the pacing of the scene down, to see the difference between the narrative dialogue and the dialogue intense back and forth. The difference between, again, in the video I made before, it's the difference between watching a tennis match where if you look away, you could miss something critical, and watching a football match where if you look away and you come back 20 minutes later, the score is likely to still be the same as it was when you left, right? Like it's a different kind of storytelling. It's a different kind of game. So, all right, so maybe Fee says, stay back. And maybe we don't even really know who she's talking to. Is she talking to the pumpkin or is she talking to Agatha? Maybe we don't even know. Maybe it doesn't matter, because it's those utterances that we make in the heat of the moment where it's like, what's happening here? We want to, that helps keep that intensity. And then maybe Aggie says, instead of are you talking, is it talking? Right? And then maybe, and then, oh, okay, so then Fiona says, of course it isn't talking. It doesn't even have a mouth. And then maybe the pumpkin says again, instead of as a question this time, maybe it says, Mother, you've come for me. Or maybe it says mother again, but more like it catches its voice now. The voice, and I'm not an author, so you're probably looking at this going, Laura, no, that's not how it works. That's okay. The point is to get the idea across.
Yeah.
The voice sounded stronger now. And then it's just a monster. Fee faltered. And we don't actually even need as the pumpkin spoke again because the voice sounded stronger. And then the pumpkin says, I've waited for you, right? The voice was clear now. Okay, so now you immediately go to Agatha, going back to the fact that the pumpkin is talking, right? And immediately she goes into the idea that like, this is something to be praised. And then from there, you get into the how. Now, as a reader, I have 6,000 questions before I want to praise this thing for talking, right? Like, where's its mouth? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it coming after us? Right? So you want to think about what experience do you want to shape for the reader? Do you want us to like be proud of the fact that this pumpkin can talk? Or do we know that this pumpkin is the one that's actually doing the killing? So that's a question that you as the author are going to need to answer, because at this point for me, this is a talking pumpkin. Okay, maybe the pumpkin can talk, but can the pumpkin think? Is the pumpkin the one doing the killing, or is the pumpkin being controlled by something else? Right? So all of these questions are flooding into my head. You answer them in a couple of exchanges when you start talking about the humans killed my brother, but you actually know you have, I guess this is Fiona here. Okay, so you can talk. Why did you kill those humans? Right? Like they've made the jump here that this talking pumpkin is the killer. Now, this may have been explained in earlier chapters that I didn't see, that they know that, okay, the pumpkin is actually doing the killing. The pumpkin is the one that's thinking. Maybe we already know that. But if we give them the chance to kind of talk through that. So if we like this idea that Agatha is very proud of her pumpkin, and that the fact that the pumpkin can talk, right? Like, then we need to lean into that, right? Like, so Agatha's saying, clever boy, Fee is saying, how? And the pumpkin is now responding with, I listened and learned, right? But what question are we asking? Is it a surprise to them that this pumpkin can talk? Or is this like, yeah, sure, inanimate objects start talking and doing things on their own all the time in this world? So why don't I stop talking for a second and you kind of give me an idea of what questions do you want the reader to have at this point? And then we'll figure out how we can put them into the story to keep them at that moment of like, there's so much happening right now. I want to talk about what's happening.
Yeah, so I think so they're definitely surprised. They're not expecting it to be able to talk.
Okay.
And so my books don't take themselves too seriously. So there is like some humor in them. And Agatha would definitely be like proud parent. She has grown this pumpkin, over a year ago, and now it's talking. Like, it is, I mean, she is a mother, she has a child. So this is like now another like child to her, so she would be proud of it.
Okay.
Whereas Fee, much more logical, focused on finding a killer, like that is her job um in this world. So she is much more kind of to the point.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember if the reader knows by this point. So they found it in its lair, kind of talking to all these moldy pumpkins that it's rescued from around town, and kind of brought
Mm-hmm.
to save them and like take care of the jack-o'-lanterns and like give them some respect. But it also has human heads that it has been decapitating as kind of revenge for this. And I think they find that layer just before this chapter. So they've kind of found the decapitated human heads. They found all these like moldy pumpkins that are decomposing. So, but they're definitely shocked that it can talk. Like the
Okay.
idea that it moves around, I think they can kind of get with, but
Okay.
like it's talking, they can't.
Okay, so they know it's a murderer. They know that it's been collecting all of these heads, both vegetable and human.
Yes.
But it is the talking that's okay. So then let's lean into that a little bit more, right? Like the surprise of the fact that it's talking, right? So the voice was clear now. Maybe there's a question where maybe Fee says, because Fee's the more, in this case, you said Fee's the more logical one, Agatha's the one who's like having more pride. So maybe Fee says, that's not possible. Who's doing this, or who's behind this, or who's helping you, whatever it is that she thinks is trying, like she's trying to logic through this moment of this pumpkin talking. I'm just going to put in parentheses here, making this happen. Because honestly, this was the question that I had, is like, how is this pumpkin talking? And why are these two witches so okay with it? Is it just because I don't spend enough time in the witching world that pumpkins can talk? Or like, that was my question. I was like, what, what's happening here? And then maybe the pumpkin says, it is possible, or whatever. He says something much more clever. And then Agatha can take this, instead of you are talking, aren't you? And having him say, oh, actually, you know what? We can take that out because this is her pride, right? Agatha sounded proud of the sentient vegetable. Just move that up there. And then he says, I am. And she says, clever boy. And then instead of, I mean, it feels more to me like Fiona may push back one more time while this how comes from Agatha, right? Like, oh, I'm so proud of you. You're so big and you're so strong. But, I knew that you were strong and beautiful or whatever, like giving him compliments as one does to their children. But how did you learn to talk? Where did you get this? How did this turn, whatever it is? And you want Fee to be like, why are you talking to it? It's a murderer, right? Like, it doesn't matter how it learned to talk. It's a murderer. And then the pumpkin can say, it does matter, right? Like, no one listened. And then they can like turn, like, so they have this side conversation, almost ignoring the pumpkin. And then the pumpkin gets even madder because its mothers are ignoring him, right? So whatever it is that you decide the dynamics in this conversation are, you have to kind of like pick a side. So Agatha seems to be very proud of the fact that she created this pumpkin, which is great. Like, that's super fun. But now there's a conflict because going in, Agatha and Fee were fighting against the pumpkin, but now all of a sudden the pumpkin can talk. So now Agatha has a different perspective about this pumpkin, where it's much more love and caring and protecting. And maybe at some point she's like, Fee, hush, just let the pumpkin talk. And maybe she says, do you have a name? Right? Like something to create this bond, because like when we talk to somebody, we often want to know their name, right? It's giving that human qualities to an inanimate object makes them a little bit more personable. And then when we get into this story in here, where he's talking about the brothers and the sisters and their sagging bodies and the trophies, this becomes a paragraph. But this should be your emotionally intense part of the scene. So I'm going to leave this part in here, and I'm going to just make a note of this in the comment here, that you can create more tension by adding a difference. I'm gonna have to pick a different word since I can't spell difference. In opinion between 2 or 3 of the characters, right? So coming into this scene, Fiona and Agatha were on the same side against the pumpkin. But once the pumpkin starts talking, now Agatha, and the pumpkin is calling it mother, calling her mother, right? Like, and you explain that down here, and that's what riles the pumpkin up, right? So maybe they talk about, how did you learn to talk? And then, okay, well, you learned to talk. Why are you killing humans? Why didn't you just talk to somebody and tell us to stop? You didn't like that, right? But whatever it is. And then if it's like, okay, but really, you never really told us how this happened, how you were created. Why are you calling us mother, right? Like, maybe up in here where they're creating this tension between Fiona and Agatha, it's this idea that, well, I grew this pumpkin. Is that why you're calling me mother? Because honestly, even if I grew a pumpkin, if it started talking to me and calling me mother, I'd have some questions about why it's calling me mother, right? Like, or, how come you never came to talk to me, right? Like, you can talk, you're calling me mother. Why didn't you seek me out? Like, these are all the questions as a reader that I'm like, well, what made this pumpkin go bad? So anyway, sorry, I tend to get very distracted when I'm editing because I see like all the things happening at one time. So did all of that make sense?
Yeah, it did. No, it's
Okay.
it's good because I think adding more conflict here between Agatha and Fee, because then at the end of this chapter, so the pumpkin turns against them, and the beginning of the next chapter, Fee, like, she asks Aggie, she was like, we need to take this pumpkin down. Are you are you going to help?
Mhm.
Um, so I think amping up Agatha's empathy for the pumpkin will just add a bit more conflict to that later kind of like that little sentences about, you know, are you going to help me take the pumpkin down, or are you not?
Excellent. Yeah. So if the goal is like Fee isn't sure what Aggie's going to do in that moment, we want to build to that. We want to build the separation. Maybe in this moment where, so you expound on this. Okay, so you can talk about why did you kill the humans, right? Like that's a fast jump for the reader. It's not fast for you because you as the author knew all along when you created this pumpkin back in book 1 that by book 4 or 5 or wherever you saw it in your timeline, it showed up in book 4, but maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't know that when you created it, but you knew you were creating this element that in a later book could come to life and actually create some murderous havoc, however you want to call it, right? Like, so you knew this was coming. We didn't know that this was coming. So there needs to be more space between you can talk and you can think. Not everything that can talk and think is a killer. So what was it that made you a killer? So when the pumpkin starts talking about this, the strange hissing sound came from the creature. The humans that killed my brothers and sisters is a question. To me, if I'm killing things, there's no question. It's the humans killed my brothers and sisters. And it's firm and it's strong and it's like definitive. And then there's a question, right? Like, what do you mean? We grew you as food, or right? Like, can they feel like whatever it is that, we've been eating vegetables since the beginning of time. You're telling me now that vegetables hurt? How are we killing you, right? Like there has to be this question of like, what do you mean? And I'll leave it to you as the author to like figure out what do you mean? But right, like we don't think about vegetables as having human qualities until we're confronted with one that's like coming at us about it, right? So one of them has to say this, and you can either have one of them say it, or you can have both of them say it in 2 different ways, right? Like Agatha can be the nurturing mother. Oh dear, that sounds so hard for you. You tell me what you mean, sweetheart. And Fee can be coming out and be like, that's no excuse, right? Like, what do you mean? That's just dumb, right? Like whatever it is, you can show the difference between how they're coming at this murderous pumpkin, if they're on different sides. You don't have to go that way, but if you want to, you can have one of them talk and the other just kind of like brooding in the background. Or you can have them both like participating in the conversation. You can kind of pick and choose how you want to do that. So I'll make a note in here.
And is that somewhere where it could be good to bring kind of Cressida in? Because one of the great things about writing that character is like, because no one else can hear her, so she's sort of speaking just to Fee, but also to the reader. So she can be quite observational, like normally with quite a lot of sarcasm in, but like, she could make a comment that Fee could kind of agree with, or could repeat, for the benefit of Agatha. But like, would that be a good thing, or would that be more distracting from a reader point of view?
As long as you have Cressida in the scene, you need to find places to put her in the scene. So if I was writing as if you had told her to stay in the background, like don't come out. But in this place up here where Fee says stay back, this would be a great place to add Cressida saying something like, this crazy monster is the killer, right? Like something, oh, we should have seen it coming. Of course, it's the pumpkin, right? Like pumpkins are the most dangerous of all the vegetables, or whatever it is that she says. She can come in here so that we know she's there. So then down here again, yes, this would be a great place to put her as well.
Yeah, I need to think about whether she should be in this scene or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, I could definitely see her being like, I knew there was a reason I hated vegetables, something like that.
Perfect. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yep. But giving her that opportunity to be part of the scene like that as the comic relief or the just the thing that helps answer the questions. If you don't want to get into the dialogue so much in a certain place, use Cressida to be the one who explains stuff, because she's probably over explaining in other places. She's the one who helps us, like, oh yeah, I don't have to worry about that because they told me what's going on here, right? So Agatha is more protective. I don't know why people let me edit. I obviously can't spell words. So, okay, so they push back, and then the pumpkin says, see what they've done, and maybe becomes more aggressive, right? Looking at the sagging bodies in the clearing. And then instead of going directly into the description of that, maybe Fiona says something like, they're jack-o'-lanterns. That's why we grew them. Right? Like something like, right, because this is their job, right? Like whatever it is. And then the pumpkin can come back and like accuse them and be like, you're the murderers. Broke our bodies, mutilated us with shapes, and left us outside as trophies on display to rot, right? And then we end it here, because that's an important moment that when we saw it before, it's so impactful to read this thing. Like, I've never thought about a pumpkin this way. Yeah, of course I've seen pumpkins sagging at the end of Halloween and getting smashed by baseball bats by older kids, or like thrown into the woods to just melt and rot. But I never thought that possibly that pumpkin had a feeling or had a voice, right? So now all of a sudden this is really impactful. But before, when it was buried between the humans killed my brothers and sisters, did you see what they've done? And then I've only done the same as those who have tried to hurt me, right? Like, I don't see the impact of it. But now when we're pulling it back and forth, I can't miss that. I can't skim over that line of dialogue, because it's coming right at me, and it's much more intense because it's the only thing that's being said. We don't have to see that the vine is moving its gestures, right? Like, it told us that it was there before. We pushed back with what humans would say. That's what they're for. Like, what do you mean this is a bad thing? We've been doing this for generations, whatever it is that they say. And then now, and here's this moment where now you're going to see the difference between that, the two different directions that Agatha and Fiona have been going, right? Like, now we have this moment of this vegetable has human feelings. Sometimes we want to respond with anger, and sometimes we want to respond with compassion, right? So maybe this is where Agatha and Fee, we pull that tension that tension thread just a little bit further. Agatha's can say something like, you're right, like we should have treated you better. And Fiona can be like, it's a pumpkin, right? Whatever it is, just giving them that moment of, because you set this up in a really great way in that you've got two different people here, right? Oftentimes when we read things like this, we have this struggle with, it's a vegetable, but it has feelings. It's a vegetable, but it has, right, like the two sides of that, giving your two characters two different perspectives on that moment allows us as the reader to be like, yeah, but no, yeah, you're right, right? Like that gives a more of a conflict, which allows us to lean in just a little bit more. Now, I just want to take a second and go back to the beginning of the scene, and I want to look at the scene itself, because we really didn't add any more words. We added maybe 2 or 3 different like dialogue elements, but we added a lot of length to the lines, right? We've added maybe, I should turn on the line count. 1, 2, 3. We've added maybe 10 lines, but only like 3 or 4 lines of dialogue. So we've added bulk, but we've made things move a lot faster, because now it's mother, fee froze, mother, pumpkin, stay back. Is that you? Are you talking? Of course it isn't talking. It doesn't even have a mouth. Mother, it sounded stronger. It's just a monster making noise. I've waited for you. That's not possible. How is this happening? You are talking, aren't you? I am. Clever boy. How? Right? Like, you see how fast the scene moves now? Even though there are more lines and more words, we can't look away from the page, because the return is happening so fast that now we're really invested in the story. And we've given the reader, the opportunity to like delve in to some of those questions that they may have had that was happening. And we can really kind of lean into it now and still hear the same story. Like we added one line for the pumpkin as he was explaining why he's doing this. Everything else was already written. We just spaced it out differently and allowed Agatha and Fiona and Cressida to be part of that conversation, as opposed to somebody just standing there talking about what they've done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and I really like that as a way to kind of break up some of the exposition, like, you know, the classic like villain monologue at the end, which is sort of where the pumpkin was going. Like, he has a couple of paragraphs which basically explain his entire motivation and how he became sentient and kind of like his whole backstory up till now. Which I didn't want to make longer than that, but I like the kind of back and forth and the pace of it a lot more now than where it was before.
Excellent. I'm really glad you liked it. So let's talk about how you can do this on your own, because you have another half of a scene here and you've got a couple of other scenes. So the one thing that I always try to help writers do when they get into an emotionally intense scene like this is think about how much dialogue they have versus how much prose they have. And anyone who's ever listened to the Dialogue Doctor podcast knows I love a good color code. So sometimes what I'll do if I'm really struggling with the scene is I'll go through and I'll highlight every character in a different color. In this case, I would probably color code Agatha in green, because she's a nature witch. And her hands are green. I'd probably do Fee as blue, because electricity is blue in my head. I don't know what color it actually is in the world, but it's blue in my head. The pumpkin obviously is going to be orange. Cressida would probably be purple to me, because I don't really know how to get a handle on Cressida. So purple. Usually orange is confusion in my head, but orange is the pumpkin, and pumpkin supersedes confusion. So Cressida would be purple. And I would, I know it's so weird.
I'm loving like your logic for it. It's like, it's so good.
Well, I mean, it just like, that's just how the world looks to me. Everything just has a color, but I don't know, whatever. So I would color code it, and then I would be able to see if there's too much of one color in one place, or if there's too much prose around it. Now, when you're color coding for a pacing like this, it's tempting to take, I'm going to go to a different scene. No, there was one up here before. Okay, so this one here. I know I took out the back part of this. Fee froze. I would highlight fee froze in blue. But then I would leave the rest of that line unhighlighted. Even though it's what Fee's thinking, it's not her body language or her dialogue. So I would leave it out. And the reason that I would do that in this moment is part of what we're looking at in intensity of a scene is how much of your words on the page are colors and how much of them are white, right? So Fee freezing is her physical response. It's her body language. So body language counts as parts of dialogue, but thoughts do not. So this would get colored, but that wouldn't. This would get colored, but that wouldn't, right? Like, so you would go through, and one thing you're looking for is making sure that there's equal representation of your characters throughout. You also want to make sure that the bulk of what's happening in the scene is color coded, and you only have a few little bits of the background information, right? So again, when we get the pumpkin saying mother for the first time, we only need to know that the voice was thick and deep. We don't need the extra words in this case. In a different scene, in a more build-up scene, yeah, definitely add that extra understanding of what's happening. But now you're confronting the killer for the first time. If I were ever in a situation where I was confronted with a killer, vegetable or not, I'm probably going to stay so focused in the moment that my thoughts go dim, right? Like, because I can only focus on the fact that my heart is beating and racing so fast and this killer is in front of me. That's what we want to help the reader do by taking out some of those other things that we could do when we're thinking clearly and we're processing clearly and we're not having an emotionally intense scene. So by keeping the dialogue moving very, very quickly, taking out anything superfluous, we're not giving them the chance to realize that, oh, I could be thinking about these other things. I could be thinking about the fact that this killer is a pumpkin, right? We don't give them that chance because we just throw something new at them over and over and over again. So that's the first thing that I do is I look at the balance of the color codes to the white. And then I look at the balance of the color codes to each other. So down here, we haven't gotten to this yet, but the pumpkin shrugged and says all of this stuff. So this stuff becomes orange. That's red. I don't have orange, so it's going to be red. And then we get this much more, and then we get this much more. So now we actually have like 4 paragraphs of orange that is currently being represented by red, right? This is a lot for people who are used to this like emotionally intense back and forth, back and forth. They're talking, they're yelling, they're pointing. Agatha's taking one side, Fiona's taking another side. The pumpkin's just trying to handle its outrage because do I kill these people that are in my pumpkin patch or not, right? Like what happens? And then we get, like you said, this monologue at the end. The trick to breaking up a monologue is not just to break it down into smaller pieces and put other people like responding to it, because it would be really easy to be like, I woke up in a metal prison with low walls, alone and afraid, right? And then Agatha says, oh, you poor thing. And then the pumpkin says, I escaped and fled from the shelter. And then Fiona says, somebody should have seen you and stopped you. And then from there, I moved to the woods, and it like becomes like this, just the same thing, just broken up. That is one way to do it, right? Like you can make that happen. The other thing that you could do is instead of Agatha saying, oh, you poor thing, Agatha takes this, I escaped and fled to shelter, which was the pumpkin's line, and we simply change that and we make it say, how did you escape? right? And then the pumpkin can say, I waited for, I'm not sure why it was the metal prison with low walls. Was it like a vegetable garden thing or?
No, so as you're saying this feels like a good sort of point to add in some more backstory because they could like look at each other, Agatha and Fee, I mean, and be like, the back of your pickup truck, because that's like where it came to life. So that's
Perfect.
the prison with low walls that it escapes from. Um,
That's
so
awesome. Keep going.
yeah,
I'm just going to type while you.
yeah, no, so I think there's definitely like they can have a realization that the magic that happened at the end of book one like led to it. That's where it woke up. Um, and then it's like, but how did you get out of the car or whatever? Obviously,
Right.
better dialogue than this. And then it could talk about it moved there, it got graffitied, which is why it has like a face, even though
Hmm.
it's not really talking with a mouth.
Right.
And then it could be like, but they could have something about, but how are you talking? And then it could explain that a bit more.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think there's probably like a bit more of the backstory and the link to when it was created um, that I could do in that bit to break it up.
Yep. So the trick here is going to be you want to answer the questions about the backstory, but you don't want to get too far away from the fact that there is a murder happening, right? Or that there have been murders happening. So when you're doing this, you may decide that you want this part to happen before the how did you talk, why are you killing
Yeah.
humans, right? So if you switch this part here about killing with this part about how did you come to life, then the anger that rebuilds here, we get the intensity of the fact that the pumpkin is talking, and then which gives us like a big emotional spike. And then as they start learning about like what's happening, that spike lowers. And we want that, right? Like, because if we just stay on this super, super high emotional high, when you get to the fight scene in the next scene, we don't have anywhere to go. So by creating this backstory, you're letting us see that this pumpkin is a little bit more human than we thought. We're kind of relaxing a little bit. It's taking our roller coaster down because we know we're going to push it right back up when we start talking about murders, right? And then maybe as we're talking about the murders, we said that maybe Agatha is feeling a little bit of compassion for the pumpkin. So again, we're going to take that roller coaster down just a little bit. And then we start talking about the creators and the fact that the pumpkin was an accident, which can infuriate him all over again. Or maybe the fact that he was an accident infuriates him before they start talking about the murders, right? Like however you decide that that story unfolds, you want to give us a slight roller coaster where you're taking us up, you're bringing us back down, you're taking us up, you're bringing us back down, but you're not changing the speed of the dialogue coming at us. You want everything to remain short and quick, moving back and forth between your characters, because that'll keep the intensity up, but it'll allow for the emotion to ebb and flow a little bit so that when you get to the place where the pumpkin is outraged and tries to attack them, we are like, okay, now I'm fully on board in here and I'm ready.
And when you talk about like the pumpkin's outrage and why he or it decides to like attack them, and they are like
Mhm.
that they do get into conflict. So the spark for that I've got in there at the moment is not the murders, because to be honest, the pumpkin doesn't really care that he's been killing people. He
Right.
in its eyes, it's like protecting its kin, these other
Right.
pumpkins that people have been killing, and what it
People
actually
declared
wants.
war.
Yeah, and what he actually wants is now that he's, finally got his creators with him, he wants them to recreate basically the spark in him. So
Mhm.
like proper Frankenstein, I want more of me and you two are going to help me do that.
Right.
And then they're both like, no, we don't even know how we did it the first time.
Right.
So we can't help you. You were an accident. And that's kind of what then sparks him to attack them, because although he's like maybe not on their side and he's kind of angry at them, and like you said, the peaks and troughs, we can get more of that. He doesn't attack them because he wants their help ultimately. And it's when they deny that is like when the conflict turns physical.
Yeah, and I love that. And and that makes tons of sense to me. As I was reading it before and as you're explaining it to me now, right? Like it made sense that it's the fact that that they won't help that is the most important piece. So I think what you want to do when you're talking about this idea of you're going to help me bring them to life, this idea of at first we can't, and he's like, of course you can, it's easy, just do what you did before. And they can be like, it was an accident. And the pumpkin can be like, if you did it once, you can do it again. And then they need to come outright and say, yeah, we're not doing that, right? Like there has to be a more definitive, like, no. And you can have it set up to be that Agatha is like more like careful about it and more like nurturing about it. Like, you're here now, let me just protect you. And the pumpkin can be like, that's not enough. And Fiona can be like, we're not protecting that. It killed people. We don't protect killers, right? And then that conflict between them can come up again. And the pumpkin can get even angrier because they're still treating it like an inanimate object, even though it is now like, it has life form in it. And then it can be like, well, if you're not going to help me, then you're against me. There is one other thread that I think you need to pull into this, is at the beginning, he calls them mother. There needs to be a moment at some point in the scene where either they ask, why are you calling me mother? Or where he says, you're my mother, you can be their mother too, right? Something that pulls back to that initial thread, because while we understood what was happening here, because we've seen the pumpkin in your previous books, we just need that moment of closure. Even if we don't know that we need it, we need that moment of closure that's like, okay, now I get why you're calling me mother, right? So maybe when he says, it was your magic that animated me, then Cressida can be like, oh, that's why that idiot pumpkin was calling you all mom, right? Like whatever it is, just to close that thread, tie off that thread. It doesn't have to be there, but it'll just make the scene seem so much more seamless and complete when there's this huge battle that comes next.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Can definitely bring that kind of out more.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, so just a quick recap of the way that we can do this is when we know that we're getting to a climactic scene, we know that we want the emotion to happen really fast. In our first pass of what we write, we're going to write just the story because we got to get the story out. If you are a dialogue only writer, you're mostly going to write your dialogue first. If you're a more traditional writer, you're going to write just the scene as you look at it. But then when you go back and you edit it, you want to think about the balance between your dialogue and your prose. You want much more dialogue than you want prose, because dialogue is shorter and it keeps the ball moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth very quickly, which creates an intensity that people don't want to look away from, right? We see this on television a lot when they move when they keep zooming the camera in closer and closer and closer to the characters' faces. So like in a build-up scene, the camera's going to be far away and you're going to see the background and you're going to see the characters. And as the scene gets more emotionally intense, they zoom in until the only thing we're looking at is their chin to their forehead for both of the characters back and forth really quickly. We have to find a way to do that same thing in our stories, and we do it with dialogue by increasing the frequency that we're changing voices. So when we're editing, we can use our color coding. If you don't like color coding, or if you feel like color coding isn't really as helpful to you as it is to me, that's totally okay. Look for sentences that go all the way to the end of the line, and definitely sentences that wrap multiple lines, because that is going to slow your reader down. If you have a reader like me, who when I'm in that emotionally intense part of the scene, I'm only going to read about 15 words on a line before I move to the next line, which ends up actually slowing me down. And I'm not suggesting all writers write for readers like me, because I am a lazy reader. But I do have a tendency, like when things are so exciting, that I just want to move to the next thing and I want to move to the next thing. So I tend to actually miss a lot of detail when there are larger paragraphs. And then I get frustrated because I get to the end of the chapter and I'm like, I don't understand. I have to actually go back and reread and pick up details. Again, I'm not suggesting that writers write specifically for me, but I think we can learn something about the way readers connect to emotion by just understanding that quick change of character voice can draw people in a lot more quickly than a lot of prose. Prose can be very emotional and can be very intense and can draw a lot of readers in, but more universally, we think that dialogue can really do that. So that's what I would suggest for you as you are looking at the other chapters in this section, is really thinking about, especially when you get into the fight scene, because fight scenes can be really interesting. Lots of times people think that there isn't talking during a fight scene. But in this case, you have multiple people fighting against one villain, right? You've got Agatha and you've got Fiona and you've got Cressida, and they can all be like just having these utterances. When you're actually in the fight, your balance is going to be a little bit different because you are going to have the prose. But you can think about body language as dialogue there, right? Like when Agatha is pulling her magic into her hands and her hands turn green, right? Like that can actually be considered body language as part of dialogue instead of prose. When Fee is pulling the electricity into her hands the same way. When you have that moment where Cressida is trying to burn the vines that have Fiona trapped, right? Like that can be part of the body language as opposed to just the action of the scene. So by making those smaller changes, you can actually create that same intensity and pacing as you did in this scene when the pumpkin wakes up. So, well, when the pumpkin starts talking, because the pumpkin's actually been awake for a year.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other questions you have before we stop the recording?
No, thank you very much.
Okay. Well, Gemma, thank you so much for sharing your story. I learned so much more about the wizarding and witching worlds. I'm very excited about that. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. But I think I have to stop sharing before I can stop the recording. Jeff is so much better at this part than I am.